Hey, what's up you guys? Yes, today it is time for another creepy video. Now I am just warning you, today's video is dark. We're going to be talking about some of the scariest experiments that have happened throughout history. So this video is going to be graphic, it's going to have a lot of violence, and we are going to be talking about a lot of surgeries and very intense medical operations. So if you are sensitive to that, you should probably click off. Okay, so first we're going to be talking about something that you guys have wanted me to talk about for a long time, and that is the Russian sleep experiment. So it happened back in the 1940s. Russian researchers put 5 inmates in a locked room. Now in this airtight room, they released a gas. The gas made it so that the prisoners would not fall asleep. Now this whole thing was being monitored by the researchers. They were watching through two-way mirrors, they were listening through microphones. They basically wanted to see what would happen if you deprived people of sleep. And slowly but surely, these inmates started to lose their minds. After the 5th day, they stopped talking to each other. They got paranoid. On the 10th day, they started screaming and running around the room. Some of them screamed so hard that they ripped all their vocal cords. Then the voices stopped. Now the researchers thought that maybe they were dead, but they weren't. When the researchers walked into the room, all of the inmates said, "We don't want to go. We want to stay here." And this is where it gets really fucked up. On the 15th day, they replaced that gas with fresh air, and it made the inmates go crazy. They were ripping off their own flesh and shoving it down the drain. They were ripping to their own stomachs and eating their bodies. Well, it got so out of hand that the researchers killed the inmates and got rid of all the evidence. And this story never happened. This is something that the internet created. It is a myth. The scariest part, worse experiments have happened. And today we're going to be talking about some of the scariest. Okay, so the first experiment that we're going to talk about was the Japanese Unit 731 experiment. So this happened back in World War II in Japan, and 3,000 people died from experimentation. So these experiments happened from 1935 to 1945. It was happening in one of the largest cities in Japan, and they called the experiments Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. And that title was just a cover-up. So during the war, they would find common criminals or prisoners of war or even Chinese citizens who admittedly just didn't like Japanese people, and they would do experiments on them in the name of science. Now this included men, women, and children. So here are just a few of the ways that they tortured their victims. Number 1, frostbite testing. So the doctors would take the victims' limbs and dip them in cold water and then expose them to sub-zero temperatures until they froze. And then the doctor would take a big blunt object and start hitting the victim's limbs with it. Now the experiment was to see if the victim could feel it, because if they didn't, that means that freezing does actually numb the nervous system. But all of this was happening while the person was alive. So just imagine, you're sitting there, they freeze your arm, and they start beating it with a hammer. Oh my god, I just felt that. Ugh. Well, it got so intense that sometimes they would over-freeze a limb, and then when they hit it, the limb would shatter. Now the next form of experimentation was called vivisection. Now this is when they would slice the victim open and cut out their organs and just watch what happened. Now basically they wanted to see how long the body could survive without certain organs. So they would remove a kidney or a liver or a spleen, and they would just wait and see how long it took the victim to die. Sometimes they would even take out an organ and put it back in and see if the body would accept it or reject it. They even did this to limbs. They would cut off a person's leg and then reattach the leg and see if the body rejected it or not. And if it rejected it, it was not good. Now another thing they would do is very dark. They would rape the victims and give them STDs just to see what the STDs would do to the body if it was untreated. That is one of the most fucked up things I've literally ever heard. And it happened. And there were so many other things they did. They would burn people alive just to see how long it took for the person to die. They would inject the victim's veins with seawater. They would do so many things that they would call experiments. But in reality, it was just torture. Now this is where it gets really fucked up. after the war ended, the US government gave the doctors a choice. They would either be tried for war crimes, which is what they were doing, or they could give the US government all of the research and findings that they got from these experiments, and they would be let off the hook. And of course, they chose to do just that. And the saddest part, the death and torture of those 3,000 victims actually helped US science. Oof, that one was fucked. Okay, so next we're going to be talking about something that we have touched on before, but I've never really gone in detail on it, and that is MK Ultra. So as you guys know, MK Ultra has been talked about in tons of movies and TV shows. Stranger Things is literally based on it, but here is a quick rundown of what it was. So from the 1950s to the early 1970s, the CIA was doing illegal human experimentation, and the goal was to figure out mind control. Now, the government wanted to control the enemy's mind. So, for example, if they wanted to get information out of the enemy, they wanted to know how they could, get in their head and get that information. And the way they did that was by experimenting on people and trying to see if they could control the mind. And this is not a theory. This actually happened. This is a quote from the CIA's document. Controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, aka mind control. Now, the MK Ultra's files have all been destroyed. There's really not much left of it. But here are just a few things we know that they were trying to do. What substance can hypnotize people into doing complex deeds or telling information? What substance will create selective memory loss in its victims so that the government can selectively wipe people's memories? So the government was trying to find a way to wipe somebody's memory or control their mind, and they wanted to do that by figuring out some kind of a drug. Now, they were trying to cook up a form of an LSD, something that you could give a person and it would open up their mind so that you could get in there. Now, of course, there was huge side effects and a lot of deaths. A doctor named Frank Olson was a researcher, and he had his drink spiked with some form of LSD. After he drank it, he walked out of a 10-story building window and died. Now, since all the files have been burned and destroyed, there's a lot of stuff we don't know. But there have been testimonies given by people that say that they were researched on. Just check out this testimony from one of the survivors of the MK Ultra experiments.
I'm Christy Nicola, born July of 1962, rendering me 32 years of age. I was a subject in radiation as well as mind control and drug experiments performed by a man I knew as Dr. Green.
Now, in this testimony, she talks about a bunch of things that happened to her in these experiments. She also talks about things she learned how to do. Check it out.
I was taught how to pick locks, be secretive, use my photographic memory, and a technique to withhold information by repeating numbers to myself. Dr. Green moved on to wanting me to kill dolls that look like real children.
She also goes on to talk about really creepy things her doctor would do.
He often tied me down in a cage, which was near his office. Between 1972 and 1976, he and his assistants were sometimes careless and left the cage unlocked. Whenever physically possible, I snuck into his office and found files with reports and memos addressed to CIA and military personnel.
Then Christine goes into some really dark stuff that her doctor did, and it is unsettling.
I was caught twice, and Dr. Green ruthlessly used electric shock, drugs, spun me on a table, put shots in my stomach, in my back, dislocated my joints, and hypnotic techniques to make me feel crazy and suicidal.
Now, that whole thing is terrifying to me, but what's even scarier is what if they succeeded? What if they figured out a way to control people's minds? What if they're using it today? Whew. Let's move on. Okay, now this experiment really gets to me because it involves one of my biggest fears, which is sleep paralysis, and this is Harry Bailey's deep sleep therapy experiment. Back in 1920, there was a doctor named Harry Bailey. He was a psychotherapist who was interested in electric shock therapy and the study of deep sleep. Now, he invented something called a DTS cocktail. Now, if you took this drug, you would be in a deep sleep for 39 days. Now, the point of this was that he said if he put you in a deep sleep, he could do electroshock therapy to you and help you get rid of your bad habits. Now, the scariest part, he would sometimes use patients who didn't consent. He would literally take people who did not want this and force them into a 39-day sleep. And this was not like anesthesia. It's not like he put you to sleep and then you black out and you wake up and you're like, what happened? You are in a dream or a nightmare for 39 days and you can't escape. And as most of you guys know, in dreamland, time is even longer. So it probably feels like being in a nightmare for years. And because your body can still feel, because you're basically in a coma, as he's electrocuting your body with this shock therapy, you're feeling it in your nightmare. And you can't move, you can't wake up. You are just trapped inside of your own head. Now, these experiments led to 85 people dying, and 19 of them committed suicide because after they woke up, they had been driven so crazy that they ended their life. And ironically, Dr. Bailey in the 1980s was getting investigated for these experiments, and he ended up taking his own life by taking one of his sleep cocktails. And on his suicide note, he said this: "Let it be known that the Scientologists and the forces of madness have won." That's fucking creepy. Now, this last experiment happened in the 1970s, and it is really, really insane. And I don't really even know where to start with it. Once again, if you are sensitive to really fucked up shit, please leave this video. This is Dr. Levin's Aversion Project. In 1971, in South Africa, it was decided that gay men were not to be a part of the armed forces. If they found out you were gay and you were in the military forces, they would send you to a military hospital called Ward 22. And what they did in this hospital was terrifying. They would chemically castrate men. They would also give the men electric shock therapy and try to get rid of their gay tendencies. And then they did something that is really dark. They would give some men involuntary sexual reassignment surgery. Basically, if they could not cure a gay man, they would surgically take off his penis and turn him into a woman. Now, most of the men that they did this to did not want it. They did not feel like women. They wanted to be men, but they didn't care. Then they would send these men who now had female parts back into society, not give them any help as far as hormone therapy, basically surgically change their genitals and kick them out. That happened to over 900 guys in the military. And the saddest part is that a lot of those guys were young, between the ages of 16 and 24, and they didn't even want to be in the military. They were drafted. Now, this happened between the years of 1971 and 1989, and it is one of the most intense and awful things I think I've ever heard. Now, ironically, in 2010, the doctor who was in charge of all of this had his license suspended for making sexual advances toward a male student and various other sexual abuse stories involving men. And then he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, which just proves the point that he was doing all of this and forcing all these gay men to be straight, cutting off their penises and doing all of this because of his own issues, his own sexual identity issues. He was taking all of these guys who were totally comfortable with themselves probably and okay with being gay and forcing them to change. And it led to a lot of deaths. That one to me is awful and insane, and also just very scary and huge lesson. Either way, it is awful and devastating. Well, there you guys go. Hopefully you enjoyed this creepy video. Once again, I always say this, but I do not mean to offend anybody that might have known somebody that was involved in these. If you lost a family member or a great-grandfather or something in one of these events, I hope this is not saddening you. I am just really interested in this kind of dark stuff, and I like talking about it. Alright, you guys, I'm gonna go. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up if you want more dark videos, and also subscribe to my channel right down below and hit the notification bell because I make new videos every day. And if you want to see my other scary videos, I've done a whole ton. I'll put a link to a playlist right at the top of the description below. Alright, you guys, have fun sleeping. Bye. You know how YouTubers do morning routines that are called like real morning routines, and it's still them being bougie and glamorous? Bitch, real morning routine! Fucking come for me, Laura DIY! And all them gurus have like beautiful views of like downtown LA. My view is a tuna can on fire.